is going to be making some opening remarks. We are also delighted to have Mark Napier, the chair of FSD Africa, with us also, and Bella Tonkonoji is going to make the presentation. But before we do that, maybe I'm going to let everyone around the table introduce themselves. I have also to say that we do have a lot of people attending online, following virtually via Zoom the discussion, and we'll be happy to take any sort of questions that they may have online. But without any further ado, I'm going to let, starting from my right, people introducing themselves, starting with Mark. Mark Napier, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dad. I'm the CEO of Fsc Africa. Thank you.
Good morning and good day to those joining online. I'm Franny Leotier. I'm the chair of the board of FSD Africa.
Good morning. I'm Rosalind Kenya. I'm here as a guest of Mark, but I sit on the board of a number of companies and chair sustainability committees on those boards.
Vikram Ridge with the Climate Policy Initiative, here to cheerlead my colleagues. And I'm ex-IFC, 25 years there doing climate finance.
Clemos Landers, and I'm a policy fellow here at CGD.
Joe Thwaites. I'm an international climate finance advocate at the Natural Resources Defence Council.
I'm Catherine Silverthorne, and I am consulting with Climate Leadership Initiative, CLI, and am here because Athena couldn't join you. She really wanted to, but I'm here on her behalf.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Molly McGregor, and I'm an associate with the NDC Partnership. I'm on behalf of Guli Sabahi, who unfortunately can't be here today.
The principal reason I'm here is I'm a friend of CPI. My day job is I'm at Brookings Institution. I was co-chair of the Secretary General's independent review of the 100 billion, and I'm currently executive secretary of a group co-chaired by Vera Songwe and Nick Stern on climate finance launched by COP26 and COP27. Franny is one of our members.
Hello, everyone. I'm David Kanja. I'm a member of the board of FSD Africa.
I'm Peter Lindner, and I'm a senior financial sector expert at the International Monetary Fund, where I focus also on sovereign green finance.
Elena Lukoyanova. I'm also at the International Monetary Fund, a deputy in a new unit which focuses on climate finance policies. Thank you.
I'm Morgan Richmond. I'm a senior analyst at Climate Policy Initiative.
I'm Anuradha Ray from the World Bank Long-Term Finance Unit. I've just moved to DC from East Africa.
Sophie Zerdan, I'm the CEO of SIGAP, which is a global partnership housed at the World Bank that focuses on inclusive sustainable finance.
I'm Michael Fuchs. I'm a former long-time employee of the World Bank, and I'm working as a consultant some of the time for FSDA.
Morning, everyone. I'm Bella Tonkonogi. I'm the U.S. Director for Climate Policy Initiative based here in DC.
Well, thank you very much to all of you. We are very much delighted to have such a high-level participants around the table today, and not to also mention those who are following us also via Zoom. So maybe quickly, I'm going to give you the agenda of the discussion today, and then after we can take it from there. So first of all, I will give the floor to Franny Leotier, the FSD Africa chair, who's going to make some opening remarks. After her, the floor will be given to Mark Napier, the CEO of FSD Africa, so he can make some introductory remarks too, before Bella Tonkonoji takes the floor to make the presentation, the much anticipated presentation on the landscape of climate finance in Africa. And after that, we have selected a couple of discussants to react, and before we have a roundtable discussion. So once we are done, we will wrap up, and of course, with the networking lunch will be served. So without any further ado, I'm going to let the floor to Franny Leotier for some opening remarks. Thank you.
Real quick, just to mention that the meeting will be recorded.
Yes, this is important to know. So at the end, we'll record and post it online. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Dauda Seben, for the warm welcome, and thank you for the interest in this event. We are meeting at a very, very important time on climate policy and climate finance, so it's great that we are all here. I'd like to congratulate FSD Africa. Of course, it's easy for me to say being on the board, but maybe more importantly, the Children's Investment Fund Foundation and Climate Policy Initiative for carrying out this very timely work. It's very urgent for us. We have a few days left to rally around before COP27. So we really have to get all the quality data we have on climate finance. And it's also very important because I think up until now, there isn't a baseline of climate finance data. And this work I'm really looking forward to hear gives us a chance to get that baseline. But maybe for the third point I thought to raise is it gives us then an opportunity for really good analytical work, because otherwise we don't know what we are doing, what we're achieving, and how much it's costing. And this is really important work for that. So a few facts first. When you look at these nationally determined commitments, you look at Africa, and the aggregate NDC requirement is 2.8 trillion by 2030. Of course, there are many other priorities. So when you look at African governments, even if you look at Afrobarometer, they rank climate quite low, and they've committed some 264 billion. So we're quite far behind, and the gap is 2.5 trillion, and that's what we need to bridge. So that is about $250 billion a year. At the moment, 100 billion a year is what LND is, about 40% of this. LND is about 40% of this. So we know we have a climate finance shortfall. It's currently at 30 billion, and our annual average between, if you take the 2 years of 2019, 2020 per CPI, it's only 4.7% of the global total. So we need to increase this ninefold. That's a huge task ahead for us. Then we have another challenge. Whatever we have collected so far is highly concentrated. 10 countries account for 50% of the African climate finance. The top 5, of course, are Egypt. That would be a shame if they're not there, given that they're hosting COP27. But you also have Morocco, Nigeria, Kenya, and Ethiopia. They make up that 50%. Egypt is the highest. They've put their money where their mouth is, 2.5 billion, of which 2.2 billion came from the public sector, which is, I think, very interesting to note. So we all need to work together to get climate finance flowing in not only these top 5 countries, but in the other countries as well. So what could we do? Is there something we could do easily, like low-hanging fruit? Where would the money come from? Domestic resources, about 13%, we estimate 3.7 billion could be raised there. Internationally, maybe 85%, so the bulk of it, 25 billion or so. But international finance at the moment, when you look at where it's going, it's not leveraging African sources of funding very well. So there's work to do there. And that's why I'm very proud of the work FSD Africa does, because it does a lot of the stitching together that's needed to get leverage. So look at who's financing, what type of finances. We have multilateral DFIs. They put up 40%, so about 11.6 billion. Then bilateral aid is very key, 5.3 billion. And then we have the climate funds. They all total up to 1 billion, which is low for such an important initiative. And maybe here's where the rub for me comes, is the private sector. They are really not putting a lot, despite saying a lot. At the moment, 14% of the total is private and 86% is public. And when you look at what needs to be done, the private sector would have to do a lot. So there is work to do there. In other regions, when you compare to Africa, the private sector is at 40%. So we know one could do better than where we are right now. So the leverage ratio of private to public is quite low for Africa. For every dollar spent by the public institutions, crowds in only 16 cents from the private sector. So that's not a good leverage ratio. But the good news is Africa actually is doing quite well in the balance between adaptation and mitigation. When you look at it compared to other regions, so adaptation takes about 39% at 11.4 billion, and mitigation is a little higher at 49%, with a 14.6 billion. And then, of course, you have the dual use, which tops up the rest at 11%. And this may reflect the MDB's joint commitment at UNGA in 2019. And there's a report that came out that you could take a look at afterwards, called the Joint Report on Multilateral Development Banks Climate Finance. And we look at page 3 in particular, where it says that to make up 50% of the financing climate-related needs by 2025 would include a specific annual adaptation target of 18 billion per year. Now let's just zoom quickly on energy. I'll give just a quick snapshot because of time. $9.4 billion, so about 32%, goes into clean energy. But the IEA has identified that actually we need 133 billion. So we are quite far behind. We need a more than tenfold increase just for energy. So note that this is much lower than the annual average of fossil fuel financing in Africa, which is at 29 billion. This was in 2016. It must be a lot higher now because of the prices of energy. And 36 billion of fossil fuel subsidies in Africa, right? Still quite huge. So turning to the agriculture, forestry, and other land use, you have about 4.6 billion. Only 16% of the total is going to those sectors. 54% of the AFOLU funding is through grants, which if there are further cuts, and you see now all governments are cutting international development budgets because of the war in Ukraine and the post-COVID priorities, it doesn't look very good for this sector. So we really need innovation, and looking at Amar here in front of me, to crowd in private investment. So what are the main arguments we can put forward? First, research. It's showing us these gaps, and they're very important between the NDCs and what is available in funding. And that's why I'm excited about the data that we'll hear about today. These massive NDC numbers, they can be overwhelming. If you talk to a typical African country, it's like, where are we going to get those billions? So they can be overwhelming and maybe even demotivating. So the question is, how can we work with the NDCs in a way that they become useful? First, I think, is showing that they can be action, so translating them into actionable strategies. Secondly, that it's doable by having the right sequencing. And then finally, prioritize, because we can't do everything. So if we do a few things and people see results, maybe you can crowd in more financing. But too few NDCs are constructed from the bottom up. Usually they're like slapped together from the ministry and then they're out the door. The research highlights an urgent need for innovation and market development to increase the share of private finance in climate finance in Africa. We have more pressure now on public sources of finance, so we have to involve the private sector more effectively in finance. We need to look at creating more fiscal space, because African countries are over indebted at the moment. Debt accounts for more than half of climate finance currently. We need to use non-debt instruments to avoid overloading an already stretched government budget. International development budgets are also under pressure because of the war in Ukraine, and this will constrain even further, as I mentioned earlier, the grant funding. There is a potential for G funds, and I'm very proud to say I was nominated to become a member of the Africa Regional Advisory of G funds. I'm very proud to be on that on that advisory. It's supporting financial building, market building efforts, and using an argument called enlightened self-interest. I just wrote a short article on that, which will come out in a few weeks, arguing why Africa could use enlightened self-interest to do better in this area. And we hope that those kind of efforts could surface viable transactions, but maybe even more importantly, build capacity, which is what we need. So policy and regulatory reforms are key, especially the economy-wide fiscal reforms, because these would be needed to structure the economy and help transition to a lower carbon future. Many countries can do this together. They can be more collaborative and look at these challenges in a manner that lessons can be learned from one country to the next. But for that to happen, we have to put much more energy to building domestic capital markets, which is really the core of FSD Africa's work, strengthening capital markets, and get African institutional investors not only to understand green finance, but actually to embrace it and maybe even lead with innovative green products, for example, green bonds. We also need to sustain positive movement and the momentum on adaptation. But as mentioned earlier, we also need to boost involvement of private financial sector in adaptation. Insurance plays a big role. So there's a big role for private insurance, especially underdeveloped markets. You look at initiatives like the Nairobi Declaration on Sustainable Insurance, which can help in this. And then there's mainstreaming. We need to avoid thinking that climate finance is always a niche issue, extra cost, even though we clearly do need to find new sources of climate finance. If governments were thinking green already and budgeting green already, for example, in infrastructure, we would be able to tag green finance onto these, and that would boost domestic government's total contribution to climate finance and help us improve going forward. So I'll say just a few words. We are coming up to COP27, where I think the best research will be important to move the needle during those deliberations. We need to support efforts to build out the data gaps, and this work, I think, does a huge service to that, especially in the south-south flows of climate finance, where data is really very limited. If you look at what China is doing or others, we really don't know a whole lot about that. The data is not gender disaggregated, so we can't tell much around whether we need to do more or less. And now with this work, we have better data. We can start to play a role of observation or an observatory role, monitoring how the pledges are coming in, what they translate to, and having tangible targets and flows. So to conclude, we now have a solid baseline, and I think that is great. We can use it to develop credible, targeted strategies. We can set ambitious targets. We can track them, and we must repeat this excellent research so that we are able to hold ourselves to account, but also to hold others to account in the coming years. So thank you for your attention, and we look forward to now learning more about this work.
Well, thank you very much, Fanny, for these very helpful remarks. Mark.
Thank you, Dauda. I mean, I'm going to be super quick because you'll hear from me later because I'm going to be moderating the discussion. But I just wanted to say thank you very much to Dauda for hosting us today, and to CGD. We're very grateful, very honored actually to be here. So thank you for that. I wanted to say thanks in particular to Franny. Anyone who knows Franny knows that she has an incredible schedule, and I know you're super busy in New York. So thank you very much for making the effort. And I also wanted to recognize two other board directors of FSD Africa. So David Kanja and Greta Bull. You're very welcome. We're practically quorate actually as FSD Africa. We could actually have a board meeting actually. And I confess I'm feeling slightly unsettled sitting opposite the chair of the finance committee over there. But thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate the support. Why are we doing this as FSD Africa? We are a market facilitator as FSD Africa. As Fanny said, the core of our business really is around capital market development. So developing local financial markets, trying to make them more accessible and more responsive to the needs. Climate finance has become about 60% of our business, one way or another. And as you all know, markets don't function unless there's good quality data. And there has been a data gap around climate finance in Africa. We were impressed by the global landscape at CPI, depressed and frustrated in equal measure because there wasn't enough data in there on Africa. So we asked CPI basically to do an Africa deep dive and to time that to arrive at the same time as the African COP, COP27, so that we can all have an informed discussion about all these issues. So, I think the second reason for doing it, Fanny mentioned the baseline, and I think we can all agree that we can feel rather untethered with all the pledges that are being made and the promises and so on and so forth, without knowing whether any of those promises ultimately are having any impact. And so there was critical importance, it seems to us, of actually having a baseline that we can measure these impacts of our interventions against. And that's really a kind of core justification for doing this research. So I hope very much that when you come to see the data, and Franny has given a sort of sprinkling of what you're about to hear, when you come to see it, you can approach this from all sorts of different angles, whether you're an NDC person or whether you're a gender person or an AFOLU person. There's something in it for you. And our hope, and that was really the reason for wanting to do this in Washington, you're all in influential positions. And if you can just start to take some of this very current new data up into your work, I think we will all feel more tethered as a result. So thank you very much again for coming. We're very, very delighted with the response. And I'm going to hand it back now to Bella, I think, probably.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thanks to CGD for hosting, and especially to Fsc Africa for your support and leadership in this project over the last year. So we have been undertaking this in partnership with Fsc Africa, as well as the Children's Investment Fund Foundation. And I would also be remiss to just note, or if I didn't note, that there was a big team at CPI behind this work. Chavi Mittal is the lead author. She's based in London, as well as a large number of team members that have contributed in various areas on sectoral expertise and specific regions, sub-regions, and countries. So really a pleasure to be here presenting this work. As Franny mentioned, the goal of it is really to set a baseline for measuring progress, 2, to identify gaps as well as opportunities, and finally, of course, to inform and guide policymakers, investors, and all of the partners in development and climate finance in making better decisions over time. So I will present in a little bit more detail the data. I have to turn this on now. Just to say that this did work previously. Do I have to point it at your computer maybe? It worked when I was standing over there. Yeah, why don't you do it that way? So just to say, to use an American expression, this isn't CPI's first rodeo with landscapes. So we have been doing this for over 10 years, where we have been tracking sustainable investment trends globally, regionally, sectorally. So this is just an image of our global landscape of climate finance that was counting 2019 and 2020 average flows, where globally we found $632 billion. As most of you are probably very aware, and as Franny noted, this is nowhere near the needs estimated globally, which run in the trillions. We've also, just so you know, released other sectoral studies this year in methane abatement, in funding for clean air and climate, so how the overlap between the sectors and cities. And have also done some national landscapes, for example, in Kenya, Indonesia, India, and we are about to start an exercise with the South African government, working on a landscape of South Africa specifically. So next slide, please. So just drilling down now into the data for Africa that we developed under this project, and helping you to visualize and deepen a little bit your understanding of this data. So we, our analysis estimates that Africa needs $2.8 trillion or $280 billion annually this decade for climate finance. That's actually taking data directly from African NDCs, what are African countries themselves saying that they need in terms of climate finance. And against that, we tracked in this project $30 billion annually. So that's a 9x difference between the climate finance that is flowing in Africa. So that's maybe just to say, when we say climate finance, we're not just saying international climate finance, we're saying all finance, domestic and international, that has climate objectives. public and private. And so, so that the difference then is this 9x. And in truth, probably that gap is actually, could be, or is likely to be greater, given that there's so many methodological constraints, especially in adaptation around just defining needs. So how do you cost needs? There's no kind of clear standardized methodology around that. And so this is an estimate, right? But this is kind of where we are. And I don't think the story would change much if the numbers changed, because the basic story is we're nowhere near where we need to be. So on the next slide, then we dived into subregions. So we took that, I think these are the African Union subregions. And investment gaps actually vary between countries and regions. So the Southern Africa region shows the biggest investment gap. This is mainly attributed on one hand to the high climate finance needs identified by South Africa, which has done a quite comprehensive exercise around this. And then also one of the lowest levels of sub-regional climate investments. So that's the $2 billion, the blue bar on that one. And then country level, we also compared some of these gaps to countries' GDP. So we saw that several countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, Somalia, a few others have very high investment gaps. So 57% to 128% of their GDP, implying that more finance is needed in those countries, especially from external, to be mobilized from external sources. Going on to the next slide, climate finance, as Franny mentioned, is quite concentrated in a few countries. So 10 countries absorbed more than 50% of Africa's climate finance. That's actually in proportion to, or proportionate to what they say the needs are. So those 10 countries are also 65% of the needs identified in Africa for climate finance. South Africa, again, is a big portion of all of this. In contrast, the bottom 20 countries where you have very high climate vulnerability and low emissions generally contracted only 11% of the finance. So, our conclusion here is really that the distribution really demands more assessment at the country level to really better understand those financing gaps, what is going on at each country and those country-specific opportunities. So on to the next slide. This is a classic CPI Sankey diagram. You can also call it a spaghetti chart. Not to overwhelm you with the data, but just to pick out a few things. So the blue bars, so as you go from left to right, that's how we're tracking flows. So on the left is whether flows are domestic versus international. In the middle are then who is delivering that finance, whether it's government, DFI, private sector, et cetera. And then on the right are the instruments they're using. So the blue bands are public finance, so you can visualize what Franny was talking about, that 85, 86% of total climate finance in Africa is public, and most of that is international public, which is the major share of climate finance in Africa. So it's international climate finance is 85%, and then most of that is international public climate finance. And then on the right-hand side, you can see that there are grants at, I think that's 8.7 billion. And then the two middle bars are loans, both low cost and commercial. So the loans are preferred instruments for delivering climate finance in Africa at about 56%. And this varies by country, sector, and type of project, which I'll talk about in a minute. So then on the next slide, if you compare then public versus private finance across regions, I think you see, for me at least, one of kind of the more worrying conclusions of this report is that Africa, if you compare it to all other regions in the world, has a much, much lower share of private finance for climate action than any other region in the world. And so I think this is something that's worth digging into quite a bit. So So you see, for example, South Asia, 36%, Latin America, 48%. And then as you get to more and more developed economies, the share really flips and you have those economies being predominantly privately financed for climate. So there's a lot of opportunities and questions here. How do we bring the private sector in? I'm really happy to hear, Franny, you're involved in that GFANS initiative. I know that's something that they are really trying to figure out. For policymakers, of course, how can we improve on the regulatory environment? And then for public finance sources, how can we do better at leveraging those scarce public resources for to mobilize that private investment, where just a small share of every dollar is mobilizing private investment. So moving on to the next one, just to say on instruments, so this is grants, debt, equity, et cetera. Multilateral DFI financing was more than 77% through loans. So those are the purple boxes, the light and dark purple on the chart, and then grants stood at about 20%. So that's the blue boxes. Financing by international governments was mostly grant-based. I think one thing to note from this chart is really the scarcity of equity finance and why that is. If you think, a lot, for example, for a renewable energy project, it should be 70 debt, 30% equity. So, or yes, 30%. So why is it actually a lot lower in the numbers that we're seeing? Then, as Franny mentioned, just on the next slide, we do see a better balance of adaptation and mitigation in Africa than you see in other regions, and certainly globally, where globally adaptation finance is about 7 to 16% of total climate finance. In Africa, that shows about 39%. So I think there are, in particular in the development finance community, you do see adaptation finance being paid much more attention to, and big increases over the last few years, in particular on adaptation finance. And this is certainly a positive trend given the Africa's disproportionately high vulnerability to climate change, especially vis-a-vis its contributions to climate change. But I think, the other point to make here is that even if this balance is right, the total number and the total amounts for both adaptation and mitigation are still far, far lower than what they need to be. So just a few more data points. So on the next slide, just the sectoral, the next few slides are just on sectors. So energy, annual investment in renewable energy is just a mere $9.4 billion. This is the most commercial sector for climate action, so it should reasonably be a lot more, and there's a lot to dig into why that's not the case. I would say I have just that GFANS is going to release a paper in a few weeks, I think, on energy transition investment, and they're digging in a little bit into that number and that issue specifically. So around why is renewable energy investment so low, in particular international finance for renewable energy. These blocks, I think, make very clear that the energy transition investment in Africa is far lower than fossil fuel investment, both direct fossil fuel financing as well as subsidies. I think it's not necessarily that different from other regions. It's a little bit different from other regions. I think a little bit more skewed in Africa, low on the clean, high on the fossil. But this is a problem everywhere, and it's something that we are trying to track more and more to understand actually, not only the clean side, the climate finance side, but the dirty side, and making sure that the story isn't only about the clean side, but also how does that compare to what we are continuing to invest on the fossil side. Then on the next slide, just on the agriculture, forestry, and land use, that's that green, those green bars in the Sankey. So it only attracts 16% of the total climate finance in Africa. And this is likely a missed opportunity. So agriculture contributes to over a third of Africa's GDP, employs around 60% of the workforce, and accounts for 57% of the region's emissions. So there's a big opportunity there to consider how to drive more investment in that sector in particular. One more on the data side. So on the next slide on gender. So one of the things we've been thinking about a lot, and a question we get a lot more, which I think is very good to be receiving, is yes, it's nice. The quantity of climate finance is important, but what can you tell us about the quality of climate finance? What is it actually doing? And one of the ways in this report that we are looking at it is just trying to understand the synergies between climate and gender-based sustainable development. We also in the report look at questions like commitments versus disbursements and how quickly climate finance is being dispersed vis-a-vis development finance in general. But this slide is focused on gender responsiveness. We tried to look at our landscape data to understand and to tag it and understand what is gender responsive within the climate finance landscape in Africa, what's gender non-responsive, and what is completely untagged on the gender side. So we found that 32% of total climate finance was tagged for gender equality. Out of this, only 19% was gender responsive climate finance, while the remaining climate finance projects did not target gender equality as an objective at all. Adaptation projects and those with both mitigation and adaptation benefits appear to offer the most potential for incorporating gender responsiveness, with 27% and 43% of finance as gender responsive respectively. So that's adaptation and then dual benefits. And then on the other hand, only 7% of the mitigation finance, so that's finance for reducing emissions, things like energy, clean energy, only 7% was gender responsive. So again, some important opportunities to think about gender in particular in delivering mitigation finance. So those were the highlights of the data. If you move to the last slide, we have, of course, opportunities and recommendations in the paper, in the report. These are, our lead author, Chavi, did a nice job of alphabetizing them so they're easier to remember. So, they're around adapting strategies to address current future country realities, in particular, given all of the kind of evolving and simultaneous crises that many countries are experiencing, or every country really is experiencing right now. Boldness in particular with concessional finance to fund hard to abate sectors and less mature markets. The agriculture, forestry sector, I think a big one for that in Africa. The need to catalyze more private finance, including more domestic capital. And that's one reason we've really enjoyed the partnership with Fsc Africa in particular, given your focus in financial sector development. The data tracking and disclosure to really, we did the best we could with the data, but of course there's a long list of caveats in terms of what the data we don't have, the data we can't track, and in particular for governments, most governments do not track their climate expenditures, and they're non-climate expenditures, so they're fossil expenditures, and so we've been working with a few national governments to do that, but there's scope for all of them to do that. I would say that's not just the case in Africa, that's the case in every country, including this one. But that is, I think, going to be really important as we move forward to make sure that we are actually capturing that data and using that data then to make better decisions. Of course, the enabling environment, I think this is a room where I don't need to expand on that much, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what others have to say about that. And finally, just a note on facilitating climate investment at the subnational level, where globally 70% of greenhouse gas emissions or CO2 emissions are in cities, and yet cities generally have even less access to finance. And in particular, there's all sorts of constraints on cities enacting to reduce emissions within their jurisdictions. And so we wrote a paper last year together with Fsc Africa and the Coalition for Urban Transitions, actually looking specifically at Africa cities and what can be done there. So just want to point you to that message as well. So huge thanks again. I know that's a lot of data. I'm very happy to share these slides as well if of interest. The report is going to be published next week, I think on Wednesday. It was supposed to be a little bit earlier, but the Queen has a funeral, so there's a bit of a delay in actually getting it out. And really looking forward to hearing all of your thoughts on this. Thank you again.
Great. Well, Bella, thank you so much for doing a great job. I mean, it is it's the proverbial iceberg. There's an awful lot of data behind what you've just heard, and actually, one of the things that, you know, if you are real researchers here, I think one of the things that we need to have a discussion about is the data sets themselves rather than just the report, and accessibility of that. And I think that we need to have a chat about that. But there is a very rich database behind that. And I'm going to start, if I may, by asking you, Clemence, if you're okay, just to give some initial thoughts on this, and then Amar, if I can come to you as well. And maybe, so just any initial reactions, but then perhaps also thinking about the role of the MDBs, where we're seeing a significant lift from MDBs. We must recognize that, and yet we have this issue about leverage. It seems that we're not managing to leverage MDB finance with either domestic African finance or private sector finance. So that's an issue for me. And then maybe Amar also, and I wonder, Peter, you might want to come in on this as well, having a think about the instruments as well. So this preponderance of debt in a very debt-intensive environment that we're already in Africa. So Clemence, thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And first of all, congratulations. This is a really outstanding product. It's just very rigorous, and it really obviously fills an enormous gap. You never need to apologize at CGD for overloading us with data. That's kind of that's what we love. So, you know, maybe just a couple of reactions from me, but I don't want to monopolize the floor. Just first of all, just it's really interesting, this point that you were making about the ratio of public to private finance in Africa and how much it's just so much lower than in other parts of the world. And then you did then counter with this interesting point about how adaptation finance, the mix there is actually quite encouraging. And it does make me wonder, you know, just when zeroing in a little bit on adaptation finance, is adaptation finance simply not well suited for private sector investment? And if adaptation finance really is a public sector game, and I mean, when you think about it, this, I mean, am I wrong? Am I missing something, or is this really just a story about, you know, adaptation being such an important part of sub-Saharan Africa's climate trajectory? Is this really a game for the MDBs and really a game for the public sector? With potentially some models to bring in private finance, but again, this is a public finance game here. Just a second little thought. You had mentioned the quality of spending and had linked it back to gender, and I was wondering if in separate reports or in separate things that you were thinking about, you were also looking at kind of how much the dollar in mitigation, how much a dollar is bringing in GHG avoidance. So really kind of the quality of the spending and how impactful that dollar is. And this is kind of a self-interested question, because we're starting to think about this in the context of the World Bank and trying to look into a little bit of the World Bank's own spending, and how effective that spending is relative to other institutions. And I realize this is also a very heavy data lift. We're experiencing that ourselves. And then maybe I'll just kind of respond to your point on the MDBs, and I think that's a really interesting question, and I hope we can talk about that more. You know, I do wonder. You know, you've had this really record IDA replenishment this year. There was quite a lot of quite an uplift in money for IDA countries, which is quite remarkable in a context where donors are generally not showing a tremendous amount of appetite for big replenishments. I mean, part of the big IDA uplift was also just because IDA became a little bit more innovative with how it was using its own financial model. We just had a really good conversation this morning with Fanny Liuchio about what the MDBs themselves could be doing in terms of broader reforms to their capital adequacy policies to really crowd in more financing. But I do also have questions about how much the MDBs are really using their own instruments well. I just did a report on MDB policy-based guarantees. And one of the things that I found is, they're extraordinarily useful at mobilizing private capital. I think the mobilization ratio that we found was 1 to 1.8, which is a really high ratio for the MDB system. But it does seem that it has, at a lot of these institutions, become harder and harder. There are a lot of internal impediments to using instruments that aren't loans. I mean, these in a lot of ways, the loan instrument or the grant instrument, that standard instrument has become, has been such a part of the MDB system that moving away towards a more catalytic instruments like guarantees and in some contexts on the private sector side, equity is just there's a lot of institutional impediments to that. So just curious actually for other people's thoughts on that. But I do think that is one of the pieces of the puzzle to really unlocking much more financing and having the MDBs really crowding in much more private sector financing where private sector financing is relevant. So let me stop there. But again, congratulations. This was fantastic.
Thank you, Mark. And my sincere, not just congratulations, but thank you to FSD and CPI for this really, really timely contribution. Because as we go into the COP, this is exactly what we needed. I'm a consumer, and as a consumer, I read stuff very carefully. So bear with me if I go a little bit into some of the details. So there are two parts of the contribution here, and it's important to make that clear. One is a baseline in terms of understanding finance. Where is the finance coming from? Where is the finance going? This is the hallmark strength of CPI, and as you would expect, it's really robust work. Second, there is the projection of what is it that we anticipate by way of needs. That comes from the NDCs. And there is a mixed bag. And because the NDCs are what they are very variable. They have difference in coverage, difference in metrics. And, actually the paper brings some of that out. I mean, for example, South Africa includes the transport sector in its NDC. So 600 billion of this 2.8 trillion is South Africa transport. Okay. Now, I don't disagree with that, but other countries don't. And so there's an issue here of comparability, and the paper brings this out. So I'm not saying something that's not in the paper. So, and therefore there is a little bit of let's say, a issue about how robust this is. And I always think about everything in terms of feasibility. And one way to think about feasibility is in shares of GDP. Okay. And if you look at the numbers, you will see that some of them are not macroeconomically feasible or debt sustainable. So we have to kind of keep that in mind as we go forward. Second is, how do we build further robustness into these numbers? And there are two things we are doing. One, and both in partnership with the Economic Commission for Africa. So one is, there is a Tufts University ECA more detailed analysis, building very much on the same kind of approach, but on adaptation. So in addition to the NDCs, they are looking much more at kind of adaptation plans, as other independent assessments. And the bottom line is their adaptation numbers come out much higher for Africa. And they have done it at a country by country basis. So it's a good kind of a parallel study to say, yeah, as this study implies, that adaptation actually is sorry, I think I turned it off and, sorry, give me just 1 second. That's my boss and friend Nick Stern, sorry.
Just to clarify, is that higher numbers from ECA
Yes, on needs. Only on needs, on needs, on needs. Everything, because, going back to Franny's proposition, which is what needs to be done, where is the finance going to come from, what is the contribution going to be at this COP to raising that ambition. So in that sense, a important message coming out of that, which is, we just say that that work is there. We should use it because, this is about using all. And then there is work that we've been doing. In particular, I've been leading work from a more top-down approach, and that's motivated essentially by the transformations that we are seeking. And it starts, Franny, as you said, with the energy transformation. Okay, and the big transformation for the world right now, especially in the current context, is a massive increase in renewable energy. Massive. It's there in order to be able to ensure that future demand comes from renewables. It's there to decarbonize the existing system, and it's there to decarbonize demand. And that number is large for the world. And everybody thinks about that as a big emitter story. The largest increase in proportional terms is for Africa, and correctly so, because energy is the lifeblood of development. We're not doing it for climate, we're doing it for development. But in doing that, we need to do it green. And so those magnitudes, IEA, ARENA, et cetera, have done, McKinsey, et cetera. So we look at that. And those numbers, just to give the total for Africa, it's about 1.5 trillion for renewables between 2020 and 2050, so over the 3 decades. But so it's a large number. A second big message in this energy space is you have to invest in grid and connectivity and backup, because that's almost 2/3, and that's a public sector, largely a public sector investment. And then there's the transformation, there's green hydrogen industry, and transport in Africa will be a very, very big part of the story, because connectivity goes hand in hand with this agenda. So what we've been doing is looking at it more from that side, which is what's the purpose that you are trying to build, rather than what does the NDC say. And it's a good way to kind of cross-check the story. I mean, these are not magic numbers. It's a good way to, and that's the work we are doing for the Songway Stern exercise. And the numbers are not that different, interestingly. That's they come at it differently. The second is very important also in the energy piece, to include the decarbonization, including particularly for some countries, phase out of fossil fuels, because that's a cost. We don't consider it an investment, but it's a cost if you want to accelerate that. And particularly as we are looking at the just energy transition for South Africa, we are very, very focused on costing that, because I feel very passionately about it. South Africa should not have to pay for that on its own. So what is the cost that we are looking at? Then coming to the adaptation side, it's important to distinguish between 2 elements. One is loss and damage, as you said, and it's going to increase. And we do not have either good estimates for it. Obviously, we don't, because there's a lot of uncertainty, but we don't have good mechanisms. And I'm pushing colleagues in the IMF to say, you should now be much more focused on this agenda, because the existing mechanisms in the world are not adequate to deal with loss and damage. We are seeing it massively in Pakistan, but believe me, every Caribbean country goes through it, quite often. So that's one issue that we do not have. And it's not an investment, it's actually just a cost. Second, and insurance will not completely take care of it, because some of this is non-insurable risk. Second, there's a huge premium on ramping up adaptation and resilience. And there is both a question of assessments, but there's also a question of implementation, as you pointed out. We have to be able to implement. The third element, which is the AFOLU agenda, agriculture is absolutely critical in Africa for mitigation, for adaptation, and for development. And when you look at the numbers for agriculture, because of climate change, they are much, much larger than we typically think of them. So I would put a lot of emphasis on sustainable agriculture. Africa remains the repository for major carbon sinks, which will require large investments. The Energy Transition Commission assessments of numbers are quite high for that. And finally, also biodiversity. and restoration of natural capital. So that component is also quite large. It's a different approach. It's quite complementary, but it's saying, look, let's look at it from what we are trying to achieve. What does that tell us? And that we hope these two paths will kind of meet up, before. And we've been in touch with Barbara and Bella and team on this, and we'll be working quite closely to make these two come together. Finally, then, I want to talk a little bit about what Mark said, which is the finance. And let me begin with private finance, because we all know that's the holy grail. But I want to be quite blunt about the realism on it, and I'm particularly glad that Vikram's here. So, there's absolutely no doubt that in the energy transformation we are looking at, there's a big role for the private sector. Most of it should be able to be done by the private sector, except the elements that I mentioned. But there is a big issue of the cost of capital. So let me put some facts on the table. One of the reasons why, the cost of borrowing is high for Africa is there are virtually no investment grade countries. Okay. They're not even rated. And so the cost is very high. What's the cost difference? The average cost of bond borrowing for Africa is 16%. It's starting, Now that cascades, right? So it's a very high starting point. One of the reasons for it is we do not have effective global financial safety nets for Africa. If an African country runs into problem, it's pretty much on its own. There isn't a kind of a European central bank sitting there to kind of back it up. So there's basic risk premia are high. And then on top of that, we do not have effective risk mitigation for the kinds of green investments. And I distinguish between 4 types of risks. I'm working with MIGA on this quite vigorously right now in line with your report, Franny. So the first is macro risks manifest themselves in exchange rate risk. And this is a big issue in this part because you're borrowing in dollars and your earnings is in local currency. So the exchange rate risk, and in South Africa, it's prohibitive. So, you can imagine what it is elsewhere. So exchange rate risk is number one. Number two is what I call policy-induced risks. Okay, and policy-induced risks essentially means things like toll roads, offtake, risk, creditworthiness of utilities, PPA risk, and all that. And we do not have good structures for taking that on. One institution that could really ramp up in this is MIGA. It has to move from transactional to system. Can't do this on a transactional basis if you want to be effective. Third kind of risk that's out there is credit risk. And credit risk is a big problem because we are now looking at entities that are not the largest corporates. These are relatively smaller developers. So who's going to take the credit risk? So you can aggregate, you can risk pool, but you need mechanisms of credit enhancement. You also you will need to lend to municipalities. We do not, and there's a large risk factor there. We don't have that Sub-Saharan type of lending. And final element of this is you need to turn these assets into investment grade. Otherwise, no institutional investor is going to hold it. IFC has developed good structures to make this, first loss guarantee type structures to make it investment grade, but nothing in Africa. And Vikram can talk about the difficulties and the premia in Africa, particularly, very compellingly. Then I want to come to the MDB agenda. So I have a big idea, which I really want to put on the table, and it's decadal. So given what I said, which is the baseline borrowing from private markets for the sovereign is 16%, and the baseline borrowing from the World Bank, not from IDA, from the World Bank is 1 to 2%. For the next 3 decades, the World Bank, not IDA, but the World Bank must become a major source of this transformative finance for Africa. Okay, it should not be it's not an IDA issue. It's really low-cost World Bank borrowing to finance transformation in Africa. And in order to do that, we need to follow the recommendations of your report. We need to do much better on the de-risking proposition by the MDBs, and we need new infusion of capital, ambitious new infusion of capital. And I'm saying it particularly in this town. And what I tell when I meet my colleagues in the US, and I tell them very, very forcefully, I said the World Bank has lent 750 billion in terms of its history. The US has put 3 billion in for that. There is no more effective form of international public finance known to mankind or in Mars, and we are not using it. Okay, so we have to find a compelling argument, particularly given the existential threat that we are of really ramping up development finance in a very, very big way, and that and not just say we are just kind of going to be on concessional finance, because there's no way that concessional finance will tackle the scale of what we are looking at. Finally, because of the challenges around concessional finance, we have to push innovation in its use. Some of those ideas are in your report, especially around guarantees and leverage, which we should pursue. Some other ideas are also there, which is voluntary carbon markets and voluntary carbon markets. They can be used, including for things like particularly then, forestry and decarbonization of coal, etc. And we also have to think about, innovative mechanisms like private philanthropy and all. So there's a big agenda, but I feel that this report, and we have to focus on Africa, this report gives us a great, great baseline really to work from. And I'm really very grateful to you, Mela, and company.
Thank you so much.
Let me open this, sorry. Related to this issue of the mix of private versus public finance, it's not necessarily a good sign. So if it's 96-4 in private versus public, if that number is a correct one for North America, which is largely the United States, it's maybe a reflection of the fact that the federal government in the US hasn't done much. It hasn't issued any green bonds. Doesn't necessarily mean they haven't financed green projects, but it's just part of the general budget for whatever the reasons may be. But also maybe a lack of thrust, particularly in the previous administrations. One thought I also had when we looked at the financing of infrastructure, some of the issues underlying the lack of private finance and international finance moving into Africa has probably also, I believe, has bedeviled traditional infrastructure finance. And some people had referred to that. In particular, in terms of adaptation, in general infrastructure, but also particularly with regards to adaptation, and the point had been made, it's possible, it's largely a public good. I mean, if you build a dam, how are you going to charge people? I mean, you could find ways to do it that somehow the government subsidizes it, like the UK has done it in, with PPPs for road building in various sectors. But it's, something to think about. The public sector will always have to be very strong, simply, and meaning that MDBs, which usually on lend through finance on lending through the public sector, or like IFC directly private sector finance, will continue to play a large role. When we, in our work at the fund, when we talk to investors, and some of that information is more or less public on the white papers by BlackRock and others. I think the general feeling is, with regards to private sector finance from advanced economies to emerging markets and developing economies, that it would largely have to be debt at the scale that is envisioned. So we're talking, various parties came up with somewhere plus minus $1 trillion moving from advanced economies to EMDEs over certainly the next 8 years or so, and then maybe less thereafter. And much of that money being fixed income, people kind of expect fixed, not necessarily a fixed return, but they expect to get their money back. And there are various challenges. Some may be related to governance, some may be related to a lack of information on the investor side, etc. But together with, I said previously, that governments will be naturally involved or over proportionally involved in the financing of the climate transition and of climate adaptation. There may need to be different approaches relating to what was said by the speaker on the very left. Potentially, more guarantees, and maybe the taking of first loss tranches at the project level, and then guarantees and/or take up of first loss tranches at the fund level. So there have been some attempts or some working funding solutions that bring basically advanced economy funding to EMDEs. They're kind of at a small scale. We're talking I don't know, single or low double-digit billions of dollars. But these are things that have worked at least and have attracted have attracted AE funding from pension funds and others that are also focused themselves on the climate transition. So this is something we had ourselves at the fund, or we are thinking about, and but it would mean that there's potentially first of all a different approach, but also maybe different risk levels that have to be incorporated, because a first loss tranche or an equity tranche is obviously much riskier than being in the safe whatever 80 or 90% of the capital structure. One other point that we are sometimes in the fund, and I think others in the world are thinking about, is the potential for debt restructurings to maybe have a climate element. This is not very tested, and it may contradict, to have a quick restructuring, rather a more complex one. But recently, the Belize restructuring recently went into a green bond or a blue bond. And this is maybe something to consider. Depends on the country, depends on project availability. What can be made green or blue, and what is attractive to the potential investors. But it's something to consider. And we're also, so far, especially on the blue bond side, for all I know, there has been always a sort of a support or subsidy element. So Belize got a guarantee for the full amount, or the Nature Conservatory from the US government. Seychelles bond was partially guaranteed by the World Bank and had huge World Bank backing. But for these solutions, the MDBs, the World Bank, I think, can also just through support and helping to structure things, make a contribution. But without finding different ways of doing it, this $1 trillion to all the EMDEs, or the amounts we're discussing for Africa itself, would unfortunately be not achieved.
That's fantastic, Peter. And yes, just 1 second. I mean, I think just to emphasize the point about debt is the point about the context that Bella was talking about in her, I think, A under your alphabet thing, which is to adapt to the local realities. Because I mean, it's not really even the elephant in the room. I mean, it is the elephant in the room. It's a huge thing that we have to deal with. So, and I think maybe the challenge then is to make sure that when we do look at blue bonds or KPI linked bonds or whatever it might be, which I think have huge promise, that they're not just sort of on the edge and they're actually mainstreamed into the way people think about debt management. But Elena, please, yeah.
I would like to add what Peter already alluded to. We recently published a staff climate note on mobilizing private sector capital for climate finance. And what has been discussed here regarding potential solutions or how to attract the capital into the non-investment graded countries. We mentioned several points there, so I encourage you to look at this published report. It's on our website. And one potential to...
Sorry, Elena, what was it called again?
It's called, it's within the series, which is called Staff Climate Notes, and it's called Mobilizing Private Sector Capital for Climate Finance. And I'm happy to send you a link to that note published. And a couple of points from that note. One is to make, to sort of scale up a structure what was done by the Amundi Fund, by the IFC, where within the global investment funds, they take away a small part of their capital, let's say 5 to 7%, where they can take an additional higher risk, and then that part of the capital can be invested in non-investment graded countries. And also do the structured finance with at least 2 tranches, with a junior tranche going to the public sector. They take more the loss, but potential social gain. If the project succeeds, then equity will be within the public sector, so they gain from that, not necessarily just take a loss. And the senior tranche will go to the private sector, and that could be a higher graded. And we also have a section there on the potential policy solutions within that. So I do encourage you to look at this report. It can be also going in the direction you're working on. I will look forward to your report. And within that, I have a question about the data. Will you make the database available, and also the methodology? How did you collect the data? Because that's also very interesting, how comparable data is.
Thank you. To answer that, Bella, and then I'll come and talk to Vikram about innovation and guarantees.
Sure, yeah, just the data will be available. It'll be downloadable, not all of the project level data. There's all sorts of restrictions, but the aggregated data will all be available. We'll also be publishing an interactive dashboard, so you can click around on a map of Africa to different countries to understand the climate finance at the country level as well. So that'll all be released next week with the report.
Thank you. So Vikram, we were hearing about innovation. People are talking about innovation in the context of the MDB capital structure report, as well as this one. Guarantee schemes. We've seen a lot of guarantee schemes, haven't we, that have been completely ineffective. So how can we learn from our mistakes and do better next time?
Guarantees, always vexing, right? Particularly deployed at the MDBs, and Franny and Amar, others here know much more about that than I ever could. But the way the capital was allocated for a long time at MDBs, the guarantees really didn't make sense. It was, in many ways, loans were preferred because you at least got a lot more sort of return on your buck that you put out, rather than the way capital was allocated to guarantees. So that can shift. I think just building on the points Amar made, we repeatedly hear there's no shortage of money, but the problem is, where is it, right? I mean, how, and cost of capital, delivered cost of capital is definitely an issue. Risk-adjusted returns. Been talking to some infrastructure investors recently, and the question there is, why emerging markets, when the risk-adjusted returns and the alternatives to invest are substantially more attractive in North America, in OECD, in all Europe and otherwise. So there becomes a bandwidth issue, right? That's why we need a lot more intermediaries. That's definitely one factor. The other thing is we need a wholesale utilization of concessional finance for sort of regional level risk mitigation, I think. This project by project, the hope with the GCF honestly was that it would build on what the GEF had done and what the CIFs had done, and it would actually deploy capital at a much sort of scale level. but it hasn't really materialized like that, right? So doing using concessional money to address risks at the project by project level takes much longer. And I think we have enough of a portfolio of experience, both failures and successes, to define what a regional level, where is the equivalent of ARC, for example, the Africa Risk Capacity Mechanism for doing off-taker risk in renewable energy IPP type projects, which in addition to FX and political risk is a huge thing for a lot of projects in order to be able to generate debt. One idea that we're exploring with the International Solar Alliance, for example, is a sort of a credit guarantee, a partial credit guarantee that could mobilize debt both internationally as well as with domestic markets. Because let's not forget, and you guys are the experts there, these domestic financial markets aren't that developed. Outside of South Africa, they can't fully become the solution overnight in terms of financing everything that is needed. So can we think of a credit guarantee fund which could guarantee a substantial part of the debt, but is capitalized and for more leverage relies a lot on callable capital rather than simply fully capitalized sort of guarantees, right? And if things go well, then maybe that capital doesn't get called, but its rating, its ability to actually provide that risk mitigation relies a lot on the whole callable capital structure. So I think those are the sort of kind of ideas and that I think we should particularly be exploring in Africa, where the flows are going to be, or getting the flows, private capital flows are going to be even that much more challenging. So I'm happy to discuss more and expand on that a bit more, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to come back to that point, but I also want to make sure we don't leave the NDC. The NDC's out of it, so I'm going to come and talk to you if I may. It's Molly, isn't it? Yeah. Just give me 1 second on that. But maybe just to follow the theme from what Vikram has been saying around callable capital. It does seem to me that we need to think of a way to, accepting what you've been saying about the World Bank's sort of critical role here, to try to link World Bank financing to transactions on the ground. There seems to be, as you were saying, a kind of missing piece around intermediation, call it transaction acceleration, call it deal doing creativity or whatever. That missing piece is there. So is there a way that we can somehow leverage the financing capacity there more effectively in order to get those deals to happen? And that's a really important issue. Do you want to say something quickly on that?
Just quickly on that, and sort of repeating an earlier sort of favored theme is how do we sort of use these more innovative instruments, but also the MDBs have to play a critical role, right? A lot of us have been talking about originating to distribute rather than originating to sort of hold. And I think that's undervalued in a sense. Yes, it might need some level of adjustments in the way the charters work for a lot of MDBs, including IFC, but I think it is under the implied risk mitigation and the actual structuring-based risk mitigation that the likes of IFC and other deliver, I think is highly valued. And if that can be leveraged, it will go a long way in terms of actually alleviating both actual and real, perceived and real risk concerns amongst, and if aggregated appropriately and then underwritten and then of course sold down, all the mechanisms that most people are familiar with could be very valuable, especially on the private capital side.
Okay, so we have about 10 more minutes. So if you have any more questions or comments you want to make, please marshal your arguments. But Molly, right? Yes. Do you get depressed about all of this stuff? And these numbers are very large, aren't they?
You can ask that question to any climate professional pretty much at any given time. But actually, generally I would say, yes, the numbers can be depressing. But some of the excitement of working with the NDC partnership, for those of you who aren't familiar, we're a coalition of member countries, both developed and developing, as well as a number, over 200 members, including implementing and development partners. And what we at the support unit of the NDC partnership do is help match country-driven demand and requests for support on everything from finance to enabling environments to investment, project development, with resources, technical expertise, project finance, et cetera, from the international community, not just from our partners, but beyond. And so I would argue, I mean, I know that some of the data predates, for example, some of the updated NDCs in the last round, and obviously we have more updates coming in the next cycle. But I think some of the progress we are seeing on the ground is actually quite invigorating, and it does make me, I am an optimist. I think I couldn't work in this space if I weren't. But I think it's very interesting to listen to this discussion, because it really tracks with a lot of the gaps we see in our work in the region. However, I would say that there's lots of opportunity here. And one of the things that we at the NDC partnership are working on, we just recently, for example, launched our finance strategy. And as part of that, we've also released an investment planning toolkit. And a lot of the work that we as a partnership are doing regionally, in addition to working very specifically in countries, is working on how do we close the gap from the country demand side and meet investors where they need to be met, what kinds of support our countries really in need of, so that we can make sure that they have the capacity, that they have the resources at hand to actually start expanding the project pipelines, for example, of investable projects. So that's very much a core part of our work. And I look forward to discussing with anyone who wants to learn more. But some of the examples that were highlighted in the data presented by Bella really speak to me, as far as, like, for example, some of our gender budget tagging in Uganda and different pilots that are taking place across the continent to really advance some of the gaps that we are seeing in the report. So yes, the gaps are there, and yes, the data can be depressing, but there are some really exciting country level projects and pilots that many partners in this room are part of, but happy to talk more. I think it's really about closing the gap both from the supply side and the demand side.
I've forgotten your name.
That's okay. Joe.
Joe, great. And then we'll come to Sophie after that. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just wanted to echo everyone else who said such a great report, really timely. Hope you're going to be pushing out everywhere next week in New York and in the run up to COP. So, really well done on commissioning it, and great job, CPI. Always loved, of course, the finance landscape reports. And I think one of the things, as people have said, is the baselining and ground truthing and putting some real hard data on the table. What I found incredibly striking, I kind of knew, but I didn't know it was this striking, is the fossil fuel to renewable energy finance. The fact that there's 3 times more finance going to fossil fuels in Africa than to renewable energy. Because if you listen to the popular narrative that's been playing out in the media for the last year or so, you would think that fossil fuel financing towards Africa had been almost entirely cut off. And so I think one question I had is, in terms of the breakdown of the fossil finance numbers, is that similar to the climate finance in terms of the proportion that's public and private and domestic and international? Because I think there's, that kind of granularity would be really useful. There's obviously a lot of debate about international public fossil fuel financing in light of the COP and the G7 commitments on that. So that would be super great to see more detail on that. And then picking up on something Amar said, in terms of the needs assessments and the fact that the largest economies obviously have the most capacity to do more detailed and broader needs determinations. And then I think what we see often is that the vulnerable countries get left behind because they just don't have the time, the money, and capacity to do those kind of assessments. And so one thing is to bring in some top-down analyses, sort of integrated assessment models, and I wasn't clear if that is part of the report. But then, of course, there's the capacity building that the NDCP and others do to help countries be able to elaborate their needs more fully. But I think digging deeper into that, so that we're not just hearing the biggest and richest countries within the region who are better able to elaborate their needs, and making sure that the most vulnerable, where the needs are high but probably not that well elaborated. I think including that in future work is something that we could all be doing more on. Thanks.
Great. And Joe, I should just say, actually, for everybody's benefit, there is a separate needs analysis paper, actually, as part of the same family of papers that we did with CPI, which is already published. And look at our website, that goes into all of, it's where the 2.8 trillion figure comes from, and goes into a lot of these methodological issues. Right. the full report, actually. Nella, do you want to just quickly answer the question about fossil fuels, and then we'll go on to Sophie.
I'm happy to, mostly because I don't have the answer. So I will look that up and shoot you a note, Joe. I can't remember what the breakdown is.
Sophie.
Thank you. And I want to first start by echoing what everybody said around the huge value of the report and giving us a foundation that's useful, and also for holding these discussions where very interesting perspectives are raised. I think the value add that CGAP as an institution can have in those discussions is maybe to bring to your attention some issues that may be overlooked slightly today, but could come to haunt us if we don't look at them in parallel, and that may require more analytical work in parallel. And they're all around the nexus of inclusive development versus green development, and ultimately how you really create a sustainable world. And so I want to make three points. The first one is, as many have said, it's not just about volumes, obviously, it's about the quality of the financing. And of course, as everybody has said, adaptation is fundamental to Africa. And so it's great to see that a lot is going to adaptation. But when we think about adaptation, it's really about the people. And we need to have a dialogue also at micro level. It's not just about large government-led or large private investment. They are very useful, obviously. I'm not saying that shouldn't happen. Everything that was said was super important in this discussion. But ultimately, those who are going to have to adapt the most are the poor. And so there is also a discussion to be had in terms of the financial products at retail level that the poor will need to have to adapt and face shocks. And a lot was said about the need for new instruments at large scale level. The same holds true at micro level. And there are actually a lot of innovations that are happening, but a lot more work is needed to understand, test, and then scale up what works. We're doing a lot of work on this at the moment at CGAP. We've done a scan of about 100 products, retail level products for adaptation in Africa. And we realized that most of them are insurance products, mostly index-linked insurance products. Only 2 were savings products. So a lot more goes into ex-post financial support for household, etc., than ex-ante resilience building support. And we all know that that is fundamentally important and can reduce the cost of insurance ultimately. Also, insurance is not the best tool for long-standing, slowly developing, climate-related changes in ecosystems, livelihood, etc. So first point is, let's not forget the retail level financial sector work. It's fundamentally important, and a lot can be done there. Second point is that when we think about public finance and the role of MDBs or governments, we should not forget the adaptable safety net part. COVID has shown how important these systems are for adaptation and reactions, but they're not ready to handle climate shocks. I think we're all talking about adaptable social safety nets, but the work has not been done yet in terms of funding in particular. So there's a trade-off there, but also in terms of data and structure and criteria, etc. So that's another agenda that needs to be worked on in parallel. And the third comment, which is probably the most important, is that I think there is a need to focus on the potential unintended consequences of the necessary focus on green finance and greening the financial sector, because again, it could haunt us going forward. And we start to have findings that show that there may be a trade-off between financial inclusion and inclusive finance and green finance. Of course, it's not unsolvable, so it's timely to just recognize it. We're hearing from basically what's happening is that climate change is affecting the riskiness of many borrowers in some sectors, in some regions, in some value chains. We're hearing basically financial institutions simply telling us we won't be able to finance these sectors going forward. It's just going to be too risky. And the value of collateral is also being affected at the same time. So that's one unintended consequence. The second one is when we think about certification and criteria for green projects to be presented, we may exclude even green projects that are smaller in scale or proposed by smaller firms, just like we did in the past, with access rule to financing, just because they don't have the ability to meet the criteria. And so we may need to think about proportionality in those respects as much as we did with KYC rules, etc. So again, the unintended consequences part, I think, is something that the standard setters, and I'm glad the IMF is here too, may need to think about in parallel.
Sophie, that's great, and I think very important to have that reality check from the bottom up, as it were, and just thinking about why we do all these things. And I mean, just to a little bit of an advert here, we are working also with you, I think, on a sort of a large scale projects looking at the role of digital on climate resilience and looking to support basically entrepreneurs in that space to try and build resilience through private sector models, but recognizing the role of digital in all of that, which I think is really critical. We are sort of out of time, actually, but there's also lunch, which is a really great thing. So I'm going to hand it over. I just want to say thank you so much for these wonderful contributions. We really are enormously grateful for all of that. And please, let's carry on the discussion over lunch. If you can say, I hope you can. I'm going to pass it back to Dauda. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, and thank you everybody for this very rich discussion that we have today. I'm going to try to quickly and shortly actually summarize some of the main points that were raised today. I would just add maybe one point, since I didn't have the opportunity to intervene. I think when we talked about African countries, we are talking about now, if we listen to the IMF actually, or if you're looking at their estimate, we're talking about at least about 60% of low-income countries that are either in high risk of debt distress or high or even actually in debt distress. What it means is also this is providing an opportunity to try to see how we can raise domestic source of climate finance. I think by maybe replicating some of the initiatives that have been taken in a few countries like Seychelles, like how you could try to explore some debt for finance adaptation, swap, those type of instruments that could help those countries actually raise domestic resources for climate adaptation and mitigation. I think that's what's critical, and that's important. Maybe quickly, I won't be doing justice to the rich discussion that we had today, but I certainly very much agree and see that all of us have been very much commending CPI and Fsc Africa for this very timely report, and certainly the very relevant report that has been preview here, and we look forward to having it. And certainly provide a very good outline of where climate finance is coming from as far as Africa is concerned and where it's going. And I think it was useful to have this breakdown per region, per country, and also per source of finance. And I think that's something is sort of filling a gap, not only data and knowledge gaps, because this is not something that we had before. We talked a lot about climate finance in Africa without having the real numbers, but it also fills the financing gap. I mean, and the estimate for the kind of financing gap. And this is certainly critical to guide policymakers try to understand better how they can, more effectively access and also allocate and mobilize climate finance for Africa. And ahead of COP27, this is very much a timely discussion and report, and we look forward to it. One thing that certainly we need to, that we can take away from this discussion is, of course, there is a need to capitalize private finance, a source of private finance in Africa. And I think it's fitting that also a lot of discussion has been about the MDB capital adequacy report that Fanny and others have issued recently, because I think there is certainly important need to develop guarantees and innovation, particularly among MDBs, to help boost climate finance. And I think that's what we have heard from the various interventions. And of course, as Bella in the report also noted, we need to sort of enable the environment, not only to build capacities and develop capacities for having a better enabling environment, but also improve data monitoring and disclosure. I think this is important. If the data is available but not accessible, it wouldn't make actually a big difference. So I think those are recommendations that certainly needs to be followed up on. And we look forward to the report next week, and certainly look forward also to continuing this type of work stream, because I think this is important that it is something that we can have over time. And thanks again to FSD Africa for sponsoring this discussion and this report. We look forward to hosting you again here at CGD in the future. Now let's go and enjoy the lunch, and thanks everybody, and thank you.